Hi, this is Jackie Aguirre. I'm the new host of the new What's Up channel, What's Up Latin America, where we talk about issues of import to the Latinx community. As I mentioned in my previous interview, I'll be using the term Latinx throughout all of these. Latinx is a gender inclusive term that's coming up, particularly within the younger generation of Latinos and Latinas, kind of meant to be more gender inclusive of both groups, including women, groups including non-binary and transgender individuals, etc., etc. So, who do we have with us today?
Hello, my name is Desiree San Martin. I'm born and raised here in San Antonio, Texas. Um, I met Miss Jackie through our undergrad studies at Notre Dame, and I moved back to Texas and got my master's, and I'm working in the education field right now, soon to be switching to the IT field. So minority woman in STEM, it's gonna be fun.
Yay, we're so excited. So you're in San Antonio right now, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so maybe we can start there a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the Latinx, specifically the Chicano or Mexican American community looks like in San Antonio?
Oh, of course. So it's a majority minority city. Everywhere you look, and especially growing up, going to the public school here, everyone was Latino. The outliers were Caucasian white people, Black people. Those were the outliers, and it was the norm to see Latinx, Hispanic people. I personally don't go by Hispanic, but that's how it's categorized. So yeah, there's just it's everywhere you look. It's ingrained into our city. San Antonio, of course, was part of Mexico at one point, and then Battle of the Alamo. It's super historic, and it's really interesting how they teach it here. In fourth and seventh grade, you take Texas history, and we learn how Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna came from Mexico with his army and tried to take what was ours. And then on the reverse side, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, Texas, like they were here first. You took what was theirs. It's really interesting to grow up in that culture of like the Texans and everything like that. Like we won the Alamo, it's ours, versus when you learn a more open and complete history. So that's kind of where like Tejano culture comes in this whole area where we used to be part of Mexico. There's been the combination of Texas and Mexican-American cultures making the Tejano culture. Artists like Selena, she's a huge Tejano artist, Tejana.
Queen.
And even though she passed 25 years ago, her legacy still lives on. Everybody, all generations know her music, and it just kind of shows like how deeply embedded and how deeply rooted some of these like cultures and traditions are within the city.
Yes. Okay, we're going to do a quick sidebar on a couple of things that you brought up. So, first, lots of people outside of our community are kind of confused by like Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, Tejano. There's like a lot of identifiers. So I thought we would just go through that real quick. To my understanding, Hispanic is colonized by Spain at some point. So, you know, us as Mexicans colonized by Spain, but Brazil, Portuguese, not really Hispanic as much. And then Latinx or Latino is more like land, like from the Latin American area. So Spain, if you're from Spain, you're Hispanic, but you're not Latino. If you're from Brazil, you're Latino, but not Hispanic.
Yeah.
And then in America, in the US, there's like two other breakdowns for that. So there's like Chicano, Chicana, which is like Mexican American, and both of us would be that, identify as
Yes.
that. And then there's like Tejano, which is specific to Texas, to my understanding.
As far as I understand it, yeah, I kind of identify more with the Chicano-Chicana movement, um, because it was first a derogatory term, like, oh, the Chicanos are here, and it was a derogatory term. And with the reclamation during the Chicano movement, um, we took that word back and we're like, yeah, we are Chicano. We are both parts. We are American, we are Mexican, and we are here. Tejano is kind of interesting. Some Tejanos, in my understanding and the people I've met, they kind of identify more as Hispanic, more as American, to my understanding. They're like, well, and I mean, I am Tejano. My family has lived in San Antonio for generations and generations. The border moved, we did not. So that's kind of the distinction. Like, we have always been here. This is, where we are from. So with the border moving, it's like, you can call me American, you can call me Mexican, but my family has been right here. I didn't move.
Exactly.
But yeah, so, and definitely with your definitions of Hispanic and Latinx, I choose not to, I am Hispanic, but I choose not to identify with the colonizer. So I prefer Mexican American, Latinx, Chicana.
Awesome. And then kind of tying this thread a little bit back into Texas history, the Alamo, this kind of like dueling narrative. Um, how do you, I guess, how is it like, okay, I'm really struggling to frame this question, but like you said, your family has been in this spot for years and years and years, like the border moved, you didn't. And so I'm kind of wondering how like a colonized history meets with like more of what actually happened in Texas. Because like in Missouri, we're not really close to the border. So history that, is taught in public schools here in Missouri never touches on Mexico, our relations with Mexico. We literally don't even talk about the Mexican-American War. We're just like, yeah, manifest destiny. And then we went all the way to the Pacific. And that's never really touched on. So I guess I'm kind of wondering like how history is taught in Texas and whether you understand it as more of a colonized version of history or more authentic than you would maybe find farther from the border.
So it's interesting. There was a span of years where I didn't remember who won the Battle of the Alamo, because we always said we won. And it's, as I grew more into my culture and my identity, I was like, wait, we as Texans or we as Mexicans won? Like, which we won? So it was like, the Texans won the Battle of the Alamo. Wait, don't quote me on that. So yeah, it's really interesting because it's kind of a negative view of Mexico and Mexicans coming to, they're coming onto our land and trying to, after we as Texans have, as Americans have established, our little towns in Austin, Texas, San Antonio, Texas, New Braunfels was colonized by Germans. So we as Americans were putting our roots down here, and it's kind of taught in that fashion, like, oh, there was conflict over the area, but it belonged to Americans, so we were just kind of fighting to keep our land. And then, so that's like the 4th grade version of Texas history. In 7th grade, it's like, well, Mexico's border was here, but we were disputing all of this land, and America won, so we moved the border. But it's a really negative connotation of just Mexico came in and they did this, and the come and take it with the Battle of Gonzales and the cannon. I'm sure you've seen those flags with the come and take it. Texans stole a cannon from the Mexican army, and that was kind of their way, like, yeah, come and take it, like, come over here and get it. So, and it wasn't until I got to, like, so that was the narrative I was brought up with living here in Texas, is just Texans good, Mexico army bad. And it wasn't until I got to college, I read this book, Harvest of Empire, and there's sections on all the different Latinos in the United States, and the section on Mexicans, it dives into, there's interviews with people living in South and Central Texas at that time saying how badly they were mistreated and by Americans, by Texans, and just like, you know, that whole idea of like, I've been living here for generations, and now all of a sudden, because the border moved, you think you're in charge, which I guess legally they were, but it was like, I've been here the whole time. I don't know what you're talking about, why you're trying to enforce all these things on me. And, you know, a lot of things that are, the civil rights movement is talked about, you know, that's taught in schools, but the Chicano movement in South Texas and California, there were signs that said, no dogs, no Mexicans. So there was the whites only, there was the Negroes side, but no dogs, no Mexicans. We weren't even allowed in the building.
Did you find yourself kind of, when you were younger, internalizing some of this like anti-Mexican sentiment? Because for me personally, I was never ashamed of being Mexican necessarily, but I didn't really feel like I had the opportunity to reconnect with my culture as strongly until I understood the history in full, which kind of like you said, doesn't really happen until or unless you pursue higher education and are kind of exposed to different reading material, different professors from different parts of the world, different perspectives on these kind of things. So I guess more specifically, did learning our history, specifically Texas's history, more in full, kind of awaken more of a cultural pride in you, or was that something that you kind of always had?
Um, I guess it was just kind of innate that I've always had because I was surrounded by it. You know, I didn't grow up around a lot of white people or a lot of Black people. I grew up around Latinos. I grew up around Hispanic people like 24/7 in the schools. San Antonio is a huge city, but it's mostly Latino. So I never kind of had to kind of dig into my culture because it was there.
Mhm.
And Tex-Mex culture is really big. Um, you know, it's kind of a thing like California Mexicans are a certain way. In what I've learned, El Paso Mexicans are kind of more like California Mexicans. And then there's Texas Mexicans. And Tex-Mex, the food, the culture, the history, you know, it's an acquired taste, but that's what I grew up on. So bean and cheese tacos, cheese enchiladas, there's cheese on everything. And
Facts.
when you take someone to a Mexican, a Tex-Mex restaurant, and they expect authentic Mexican food, they're usually like, what is this? This is not, and it's like, oh no, this is Tex-Mex. But yeah, like my cultural identity, I knew I was Mexican. I wasn't proud or unproud either way. It just was a fact of life. And it wasn't until I got to college and was around a different group of people and where I was truly a minority that I was like, wow, this is really important. Like it's significant that I'm Mexican American and that I'm here.
Love that. Because I feel like I experienced, something similar, but kind of flipped in a way. I grew up in the suburbs, so I was surrounded by only white people. Um, I'm light skinned. My white friends never treated me any different or less or anything like that. And coming to Notre Dame, which is a primarily white institution, is also where I found my community of people who looked like me. So, like, you took me under your wing freshman year, you adopted me, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is what it's like to have another Mexican friend who looks like me and, has a similar cultural upbringing and is also surrounded by all of these white people and this white culture and like a very different. It was just for me, it was like a big like light bulb moment, just being like, this is what it's like being able to have, friends who share life experiences. Um, Kind of another branch, a little bit similar to what we were talking to when it comes to like Texas culture, Texas history, I feel like there's, you were mentioning like the Chicano movement isn't really taught in school, and there's so many aspects of our culture that aren't really taught in school. And one that I recently, within the past 5 years or so, came across was La Matanza by the Texas Rangers in like the 1918, 1920 time span, during the Mexican Revolution. And I guess I'm kind of wondering is what's the impact on Mexicans in Texas who are very aware of these historical events that aren't necessarily taught to the broader US population?
Well, I grew up in a family where my mom was very knowledgeable about these things. She was in Mecha when she was in college, and I'm thankful to have a mother that was in college, that went to school and completed a bachelor's and a master's degree. So she kind of, it was almost like the revisionist history at home. She kind of taught us these things. So things as simple as like the Texas Rangers baseball team. Rangers, they're in Arlington, Dallas, Texas. My mom's like, no, I'm not a Rangers fan because Texas Rangers connects to the Texas Rangers. And it's like, well, they really mistreated us and they treated us poorly. And that's not I know it's just in name, but that's not an organization I want to support. So it's kind of interesting. I think even living here, living in and around it, I still think a lot of people don't know our history. It takes a lot of outside resources and a lot of, and like you said, obtaining a higher education where you're exposed to different cultures and professors from all around the world to really get the impact of like the Chicano movement and how significant in Tex-Mex culture and just how significant everything has been to lead to us being here and to lead to me going to school with all Latinos, that's really significant. But I still think a lot of people don't really know our history, even though we're surrounded by each other, we get it. I still think the history, so I don't think it has that great of an impact, unfortunately, because we're still taught American history, the winners write the history books, so we're still missing out on that piece. You have to take electives or you have to take outside materials, outside reading to really get the knowledge about our own culture.
I totally agree. Just realizing that a lot of people watching this may not know La Matanza because it's not really taught. So do you feel comfortable giving like a rundown of the relationship between the Texas Rangers and the Mexican American population during that time? Or do you want to just like let me give like a really brief, broad overview?
No, you can give an overview. I'm a little fuzzy on like specifics and dates.
Yeah. Okay, so really, really broad overview of this. I highly encourage, if this is something that interests you, that you do independent research on this. Local libraries, Latinx authors, great place to get a less Americanized, colonized version is from Mexican or Latinx authors. Basically, during the Mexican Revolution in like the 19 teens, there obviously was a lot of tension between the American Texas population, more authorities, Texas authorities, and the Mexican American population, who, as Desi said, have always really been there. And this anti-Mexican sentiment fueled a lot of violence against the Mexican American population by the Texas Rangers with the support of the Texas legislature. So lots of people were kidnapped, lots of people were killed, lots of people were beaten. And this is something that really hasn't ever really been acknowledged or apologized for in full. There have been, brief snippets of it coming back into conversation in the past couple years, now that there's more of a cultural movement to kind of try and accept people who aren't white as being still integral to the fabric of the US. But basically just a broad overview. It's violence perpetrated against the Mexican American community by the Texas Rangers with the support of the Texas legislature. So that's just a really broad overview. If you want more details or anything like that, I would highly recommend looking up books specific to the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican American communities in Texas. If you're going to look at a book at the Texas Rangers, try and find one not written by a former member of the Texas Rangers or anything like that. But it's a really interesting, very sad topic, but I think more of us should be aware of it. So if that's something that you're interested in, highly recommend independent reading on that. Okay, kind of segueing, but not really. Tejano, Texas, Mexicans who have been here forever. The border moved, they didn't move. How do you find political engagement with that? There's been a lot of discussion in the news about the 2020 vote projections and how certain segments of the population voted. And it was kind of a surprise to a lot of people on the right and the left that certain Latinx populations didn't necessarily vote the way they were expected to vote. And that drop was seen in places like Miami, which, you know, large Cuban population, definitely different than Mexican and American relations. But also around the Rio Grande Valley, there was kind of a not really a full grown swing to the right, but there was more of a there was more people, more Latinx people, more Tejanos, more Rio Grande Valley people voting for the right than I think the Caucasian Democrats really expected. So that expectation that we're always going to vote left and the reality that a lot of people actually didn't. What do you kind of make of that?
So in Texas, this is the first time, kind of one of the first times it's been like a big, like, is Texas purple? Like, what do we do in Texas? You know, the major cities, Austin, Dallas, actually, I don't think Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, El Paso, vote blue typically. But yeah, like you said, the Rio Grande Valley swung more red than was expected. And I think it's because of the border. I think that's one of the huge issues is, you know, I can't speak for someone living in the Rio Grande Valley, but if they're there and they live along the border, it's kind of, I think there's two schools of thoughts. There's the wall, you know, like, this is my land, I've always lived here, I'm an American, I came here the right way, you know, those kinds of thoughts. So it's like, yeah, build the wall and keep them off of my land that I own right here on the Rio Grande Valley. And I think the other school of thought is kind of like, you know, we all belong here, whether or not like the border moved or whether or not people come the right way. You know, don't build the wall, don't cut through our land, our nature, our, you know, our wildlife, our reserves and everything. So it's just kind of interesting. And I'm not sure, I think it's more fiscal than anything. It's why the Rio Grande Valley swings a certain way. A dollar goes a lot further there than it does here in the city. So I don't exactly know the reasons, but I know it came as a big surprise to see, like you said, we didn't vote as expected. And there was a heavier swing right. So it kind of just goes to show, like, no vote is guaranteed in a certain way. If you truly want someone to vote for you, you have to campaign and you have to show the specific populations, the specific groups of people that you're there for them. And
I agree completely. And, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, but I think one thing that they did really well, especially in Texas and the Rio Grande area, was appeal to Tejanos living in that particular region as a separate block. You know, it wasn't Latinx people as this big giant block. You know, in Miami, they targeted the Cuban communities. In the Rio Grande Valley, they targeted a particular thought process. You know, like you were mentioning, that original school of thought: protect my land and make sure that my dollar is still getting me a dollar's worth of value. And they targeted each of those communities as individuals rather than Latinx as a whole. So I'm not the biggest fan of the Trump campaign, but I think that that's something that they did really well, and I think that could, you know, potentially explain a little bit why people voted for them. It's easy to woo people who are being taken for granted, and I think that's something, hopefully a lesson that the left learned a little bit this past election cycle, but we'll see. Kind of going back to the first train of thought, that protect my land, I'm an American mentality in Tejano culture. I've noticed that up here as well among the older generation, like the older generation, my great Theo, my great aunt, you know, their generation is very much, we came here the right way. Why can't other people come here the right way? Like, I worked for what I have, other people shouldn't get handouts, etc. Is that a mentality that's widespread in Texas or just in certain pockets? And of course, Texas is like very diverse, huge, lots of different communities going on there. You know, San Antonio is different from the Rio Grande Valley, but just like your opinion.
Again, it really goes both ways. I guess, like, I I would say more left-leaning communities are like, well, do you know how hard it is to do it the right way? Like, do you know how many years it takes? Do you know how unfair the system is? The tests that they have to pass ask questions that your average American would not be able to answer. And then I think it is with older generations, kind of like, and especially more right-leaning, kind of like that bootstraps mentality, like it just takes the hard work and determination and you too can do it. And it's like, well, that's not always the case. Sometimes the systems are set up against us. You know, sometimes like it's systemically integrated into the fabric of the institution that, like, nope, we're going to be like, it's not for you. So I would say that's still kind of like a left-right debate, and just like with the Rio Grande Valley, like swinging a certain way, you'd be surprised just talking to people, their different views on that, whether it's like, you know, I worked hard, so should everybody else, versus, you know, I worked hard, I want it to be easier for the others, kind of things. It's a little off topic, but there's a lot of that going on with student loan forgiveness too. And it's like, I'm like, yeah, I have loans, but forgive everybody else. Like, I worked hard, but that doesn't mean you have to get into the same amount of debt that I'm in or anything like that, or free college tuition or anything like that. You know, I'm all for helping others the best way we can.
Yes, and kind of tying into systemic, the system kind of being set against you, and a cultural mindset as well. You worked in education. You pursued a high level of higher education, as did your mom. How, kind of two questions. Does that make you and your mom the exception in the Mexican American community, both in your area and in general? And kind of the opposite, not really the opposite, but like, what do you see as some of the biggest roadblocks to a larger population of Mexican Americans and Latinos in general being able to pursue higher education?
Yeah, so I don't know if people like my mother and you know, my sister has her master's as well. My brother's working on his. I don't know for the exception, because I try to think of my friend group, and my friends either have their masters or they're working on them. And I think that's a huge shift. And I think that depends per family. You know, I hope we're not the exception, but I don't think we're the rule. My grandma and my grandpa, you know, they really pushed education for my mom and her sisters. So, you know, just that trickle down effect. And then, of course, if your parent has a credential, you're more likely to get a credential and to surpass and move forward. But yeah, working in education, it is amazing to see. I mean, it's sad, but amazing to see all the micro barriers that exist for students. Whether it gets down to like the simplest of things. In Mexican culture, usually or sometimes students have two last names, their dad's last name and then their mom's last name. And even that causes issues like, oh, well, I have you down as Lopez, not Lopez Garcia. So sorry, we couldn't find your application. Or no, your FAFSA and your admissions application don't match up. You have to redo one or both of them. And it's like those little things we have to remind students, like, if you have two last names, put both last names. If you have two middle names, one middle name, three middle names, like put your full name on all these documents when you're applying to college. And then our TASPA students, our undocumented students that have Texas residence that can apply for state aid, that's a whole different ballgame, is filling out the TASPA. It's not online. They have to fill out a paper copy. So that's barrier number one. You know, what if we don't have a printer? What if we don't have access to the computer? So you have to print it out. And then they either have to fax or mail it or take it directly to the institution. And they have to do a separate full packet for each institution that they're applying to within the state of Texas. And, you know, without people in my position, we have college-bound advisors at each of the high school. Without people in our positions, so many students would just not go to school because of all these barriers. Sometimes we have to call 5-10 times and it'll take a month to get a student through all their financial aid verification or throughout the complete enrollment process. And it's interesting to see, like, and I wonder, there's other school districts in San Antonio, and my coworker has worked there, and he said, in a similar position that he is now, and he said, you know, they really didn't need me, that he was filler. They didn't need help applying to college. They didn't want to apply for the $1,000 scholarship because no, my parents are going to pay for it. So that versus students in my school district, the inner city school district, that are applying for every single scholarship they get, that are working 2 jobs, that are trying to balance school, trying to finish high school with all these barriers, you know, housing insecure, food insecure. And it's night and day. And they don't often, a lot of times they don't have that extra support from home. They get the support from the school saying, no, look at your scores, look at your grades, you can do this. But they don't have that support from home to really like balance them and keep them interested in the school system. So because for some, it's more important that they work and contribute to the family. You know, a lot of Mexican households, a lot of traditional Mexican households, it's you need to provide, or you're 18, you need to work, or you need to find another place to stay. Like once you're of working age, you need to be contributing in some way, shape, or form. So then that takes a toll on the students if they're trying to enroll in school. Well, sorry, I work nights, so I missed my advising appointment this morning. How do I get into my classes? And it's like, we really have to have a talk with students and parents to say, are you going to put in the time, the effort for this? Because this, whether it's a certificate or just some type of post-secondary credential, will get you further. You just have to put in a little bit of time right now. And it's building that whole college going culture. And I think slowly but surely we're starting to do it. I've seen my cousins start to pursue higher education, and, just some students that you're like, oh, I don't think that they would go to college, that they have to, because they're already in high school working 1 or 2 jobs, but you see them managing, you see them passing their classes and logging on. And, it's excellent. And we've built that, we're trying to build that college going culture of like, no, every student can get some type of post-secondary credential.
Yes. And, my family was the same as yours. My parents valued education and they really pushed that on my brother and I. And my grandparents were the same. They really pushed my parents. There's, been, um, you're going to do better than we did mentality in my family since they've gotten here. So college wasn't really an option, so to speak, for my brother and I. It was assumed like, yeah, you're going to go somewhere. It doesn't have to be Ivy League. It doesn't have to be crazy. I kind of exceeded the bar a little bit when I went to Notre Dame, but you're going to go somewhere. You're going to do something. You're going to get some kind of degree. And I find it amazingly encouraging that you see kind of an upward trend in that mentality, that it's worth it to put in the extra time, the extra commitment, and go to school. But I think something that is easy to overlook, not just for us as people who have been to college, but also as like a broader society looking at people in your student's position, is that, our families, whether they came here or have always been here, have been at a distinct disadvantage, socially, economically, politically. And that gap between us and them, living in a system that was built by white people for white people, really shows in all aspects of our life. It's not just political representation. It's not just our average income. It's also the mentality that we're able to afford to have about education. Um, if you're food and housing insecure, obviously, as parents, you know want your children to be able to contribute, and as a child you don't want to see your parents running themselves into the ground trying to keep the lights on. So like it's difficult to think about school when a lot of your basic needs aren't being met. And just my thoughts on that is, our starting line was further back than our Caucasian counterparts, and that's it's not that we're lazy, it's not that we're stupid, it's that, and not that we're not motivated. It's like, as a community, our starting line was further back, and we can't really think about school when you're kind of watching, you're watching your parents work 3 jobs trying to keep you and your brother fed or clothed or anything like that. And of course, I don't want to make blanket assumptions, but that's just kind of my take on that. Kind of pivoting a little bit, both of us also share something else in common, which is that neither one of us are perfectly fluent in Spanish. I know you have lots of opinions on this, so I would just like all of your opinions to come out right now.
Yes, this is something that even growing up in San Antonio, how are you Mexican if you don't speak Spanish? And then especially going to a PWI, a predominantly white institution, you're like, oh, you're Mexican, hola. And it's just kind of like, well, yes, I understand that. But I've met my freshman year roommate. She was a white girl from a suburb of Chicago. But she spoke fluent Spanish. She spoke Spanish better than I did. And she never asked me. She was too kind, but I bet she thought, because a lot of people were like, oh, well, you speak Spanish, right? And it's like, no, I don't. And it's, why don't I speak Spanish? Because the system, because it's institutionalized, it's racist in our system, that when my grandmother went to school and spoke Spanish, she got hit with the ruler, she got beat, she was in trouble for speaking Spanish. No Spanish allowed. When my mother and father were in school, same thing. You hear them speaking Spanish on the playground, you would get whacked across the knuckles with the ruler. You don't speak Spanish in the school. So in order for my siblings and I to not get in trouble, we weren't taught Spanish. We weren't taught Spanish because our parents didn't want a repeat of this generational thing that's happening in South Texas, happening a lot of places, to continue. So I don't speak Spanish. But now it's an asset. Now it's seen as this wonderful thing that students are bilingual, that know at least one other language. There's some students that know like 3 or 4 languages, and they're able to be taught those at dual language academies. So it's just really interesting to see, because my family and I, we all went to the same school district, and now I'm working in the school district. So we went from being reprimanded from speaking Spanish to me not speaking Spanish to now almost all of our elementary schools are dual language academies. Because now because white people thought it was an asset, it is now an asset to speak multiple languages. So people like you and I, who were not taught it so that we wouldn't face repercussions, we're ahead of, again, our starting line got moved back again because we thought we were doing the right thing by not learning it so that we wouldn't be mistreated, we wouldn't be looked at different for speaking a different language. And now it's a deficit to us. Now we don't speak Spanish, and we have people in our own communities that are like, well, you're not a real Mexican then. And it's like, no, I am. It's just, it had nothing, it was not my fault, it was not my parents' fault, it was the system's fault, the institutionalized racism that caused this trickle-down effect. So, you know, I took Spanish in high school, I took Spanish in college, I'm not fluent, but, you know, hopefully if I have children that they are fluent, because now it's an asset. Now it's like, and it's a part of the culture that I'm missing. I can understand it when people speak, but it takes me a long time to form sentences. It's like, okay, I know all these words unconjugated. How do I put them in a sentence? And by then the subject has been changed and I'm trying to think of another sentence. And so, yeah, no, that's a really heated debate that I've gotten into. And a lot of people just don't know that history. So they're like, what do you mean you don't speak Spanish? And it's like, well, there's a reason behind it. There's a reason for everything. My parents weren't just like, oh, you know what? We don't want to pass down that part of the culture. It's like, no, they thought they were protecting us and doing us a favor.
Exactly. I'm in the same boat all the way. You know, my family came to this country in 1916, fleeing the Mexican Revolution. And, you know, they settled here, and like same story. My great grandparents only spoke Spanish. And so obviously that was the language that my grandparents grew up learning. But, you know, they were punished in school. There was a risk of violence in society if they were speaking that language outside of their home. Um, so to protect my parents, they didn't want them to learn Spanish. You know, my parents picked up some of it because their grandparents only spoke to them in Spanish. But by the time you've gotten, you know, 4 generations in, or it's been discouraged long enough, how are we expected to know that? You know, our families have taken steps to protect us from something that was a very real threat to them. And in some ways it definitely is, you know, still kind of a threat depending on what kind of part of the country you're in or the kind of people that you're around. Every once in a while, you know, those videos go viral of people speaking another language getting, you know, harassed or attacked in supermarkets or restaurants or anything. But, you know, similar to you, I took Spanish in high school, I took Spanish in college. I understand when it's being spoken to me, but my ability to respond back is like very rudimentary. I could probably get there if you gave me enough time and patience, but it's not great. And that's been a source of shame for me lately, even though I know like logically in my head this isn't my fault, wasn't a decision that was consciously made, it was a decision the system made for us, and it doesn't make me any less a part of my culture. But you know, I feel that because you get judged from newer arrivals who are fluent in Spanish coming into a culture where speaking Spanish is an asset, and from, you know, if you've got family back in Mexico or friends back in Mexico from them as well. You're, kind of seen as like, oh, a sellout, like fully bought into this idea of America, threw away your culture so that you could fit in. And it's so frustrating because that's not what happened anywhere.
So yeah, I have two ideas that pop into my head. I feel the same, not, well, yes, a small sense of shame because my Spanish speaking students or students that Spanish is their first language, they feel more comfortable in Spanish. I have difficulty helping them out. They'll talk to me and some students are, we've worked it out. They'll talk to me in Spanish. It takes me a little while. I'll reply in English. It'll take them a little while, but it's hard for me because I'm leaving out I'm leaving out a population of our students where I have to call in for help. I have to call in my more fluent Spanish speaking coworkers to say like, hey, can you help me out with this? Because I want the student to be advised. They need help. They're asking for assistance. I'm not going to turn them away. And then the other kind of like little branch that you said, like, it kind of reminded me of I don't want to say tension, the differences between, I guess, American Latinos and international Latinos at Notre Dame. And it's probably everywhere, not just Notre Dame, but I didn't speak Spanish. So I was seen as less than. And especially from international Latinos, they looked upon us, even Spanish speaking, these westernized American Latinos as not fully understanding and not, I guess, like not knowing the struggle. And it's like, while we're not from the home country, we still have a struggle here in the United States. So, and I don't know if it was a Notre Dame thing, but I think it's everywhere that it's kind of like, oh, well, now you're westernized, you're American, and that means you don't have our core beliefs, our core values. And it's like, no, we still do. I just happen to be born over here.
And on the flip side of that, we look Latino. There are still elements of our culture we hold on to. Usually food, religion, and family values are like the three big ones that kind of persist along no matter how long you've been here. My family still serves Mexican food. We're still born and bred Catholics, and family above everything else. And those are I'm not just specific to Mexican, but those are, big beliefs in Latin America. Church, family, food are kind of like the big three. But in my experience, we get pushback from international Latinos and Mexicans for not being Mexican enough. And we get pushback from Americans because we're not white, we look Latino. And there's kind of an assumption that you're not American enough either. And, if anybody's seen the Jennifer Lopez Selena movie, there's a conversation that they're having in the car she's having with her father and her brother. She's been invited to perform in Mexico, and she's really excited about that, a chance to, visit the home country and make her people proud. And her dad is very hesitant out of a desire to protect her. And he kind of goes on this, this brief monologue that one of the challenges of being Mexican American is that our homeland is so close to the new place that we're living now. So there's pressure from both sides. You got to be twice as Mexican as the Mexicans and twice as American as the Americans. It's exhausting. Like, that's what he says. And, that part of the movie, especially as I got older, really like hit me. And I was like, this is how I put it into words, like what I'm feeling.
Yeah, and on that note, kind of circling back to Selena and like her importance, like number one,
Queen.
absolutely right. It is exhausting, and especially for people like you and I that went to a PWI, and all Latinos that are here in America and surrounded by different cultures that are testing almost like, well, how Mexican are you? How American are you? Because we're both and we're neither. We're the hyphen. I stole that from an artist. I read it somewhere and I cannot remember, but I was like, yes, I am the hyphen. I am both. But yeah, circling back to Selena, her father was real cautious and real scary because she didn't speak Spanish. She sung in Spanish, but she didn't speak Spanish. Um, and she was like, no, like I'll charm them and it'll be fine. And the first interview question, she says, they ask her like how she's feeling about performing in Mexico. And she says, me siento muy excited. And thankfully it went over well, but you know, the Mexican press could have been like, oh, she doesn't speak Spanish. And, you know, it could have backfired for her in Texas saying like, oh, she's speaking Spanish. I thought she was Tejana. But so that movie, it's not the best acting. um, it's so culturally important because it gives Latina, Mexican-American, Chicana women and men, it gives us like, oh, finally, like there are window media and mirror media is kind of what I like to call it. Window media is we're looking in through the window. We're watching someone else's life, which is someone else's culture, which is most movies for us. And then mirror, we're able to see ourselves in it. So Selena was the first mirror movie that I was like, she's from Corpus, which is 2.5 hours south. She doesn't speak Spanish, but she has black hair like me. She does the red lips, and like I see myself. I'm like, I understand. So that's why she just has such like a strong importance, especially in this part of Texas, South and Central Texas, anywhere. I mean, her family has started making MAC makeup, which is huge for you know, a girl from Corpus Christi to have her own, I mean, posthumously have her own makeup line with MAC, this huge American company. And it's like anywhere, like she is forever the queen of Tejano music. And if she was alive today, it's it's interesting to me because could you imagine like, so she passed away 25 years ago. She'd be like 40 in her 40s. But could you imagine like J-Lo and Selena or Selena and Bad Bunny or something like that? As reggaeton and Latino music is coming more to the forefront, you know, just imagine like where she could have taken Tejano music, because Tejano is like a real tiny small population of music that doesn't really get outside of Texas, South and Central Texas, because even getting up into Northern Texas, you know, the further you get away from the border, the more Caucasian it gets. So yeah, sorry, tangent, but with
I love it.
music coming into the forefront, it's just so cool to hear on the American top 40s to hear Spanish, to hear people speaking Spanish.
Right. And you know, this is something that the Black community, Asian communities can maybe relate to a little bit is you know, makeup not being designed for you, movies not being full of people who look like you, parts of your culture, but only the parts that are palatable being accepted while you yourself are rejected. You know, these are things that they can relate to as well, but something that I think a lot of Caucasians don't understand about Selena is they loved her, and that was groundbreaking for somebody who looked like her and sang in both languages, but who was unashamedly Tejana, to be accepted and embraced by the Caucasian population. Like, this opened so many doors for us in media, in music, in fashion, in like she kicked down so many doors. And I think a large part of the grief that our community feels, you know, she was like 23 when she died in 1993, was murdered. Like, she was murdered. If you guys are interested in Selena, you know, a lot of Mexicans are very educated on who she is, but that J-Lo movie is like a great place to start. Basically she was, you know, she was murdered by Yolanda. Saldivar, like the most hated most hated Mexican woman by other Mexicans. She was only 23 when she died, and a lot of that grief that we feel, even, you know, people like us who were never able to experience her personality, her music firsthand, comes from, in part, the places that she could have taken us. She managed so much, you know, just at 23. And just, I think for me, a lot of the grief comes from, imagine how much further we could have gone with her. But there has been a shift in the past like 5 to 8 years in American media. Like when Coco came out, I lost my mind. If y'all haven't seen Coco, the Pixar movie, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. That was like, for me, that was the first time I'd ever seen myself animated in the Disney verse at all. You know, growing up, my favorite princess was Pocahontas because she looked the most like me. Mexicans have an indigenous portion of our, you know, heritage, and like that was as close as I could get. But when Coco came out, like groundbreaking. As you said, like Bad Bunny, Ozuna, these Latino artists who are coming up in American music on the radio. Luis Fonsi, Despacito being the #1 hit everywhere was like history make. If you could make a textbook of Mexican or Latino history in the US, like that would be its own chapter. And this was a huge deal, having a Spanish titled song sung by a Latino artist, even if it had like Justin Bieber on the Americanized version. This was a huge deal for us. Brief sidebar, reggaeton is kind of started out as like underground Latinx music. It's not specific to any one place, although I think you'll find really strong roots for it in the Caribbean and Brazilian areas. It was underground because it was very sexualized, very risque, not something you would play with your parents. I think the closest maybe parallel to it in the US would be trap music. And that's kind of similar to what it is. It's kind of Latin trap music. And to me, that's an even bigger deal to have that be the genre of music that's taking off here. Is reggaeton has never really tried to be palatable to anybody. So the fact that it's so unashamedly what it is and it's still being accepted here gives me like a lot of hope. I know you have a lot of feelings about Coco, so if you want to talk about that at all, I would love to hear that.
I was like, can you tell? I was like, wait, circle back to I don't think other communities understand just how important it is to us. Well, I'm sure they can relate because Tiana was the first Black princess, and how long did that take? You know, like people have waited a long time to be represented, and they're gonna get all emotional.
No, I feel you, girl. I cry like a baby every time I watch that movie.
Yes, and to invoke such emotions from an animated film. I know Pixar is amazing at doing that, but Coco really hit a soft spot for us for Day of the Dead, and it's opened up a world of wanting to understand, because death in our culture is not the end. Death is a beautiful thing, and we don't mourn them, we celebrate their life. So having Miguel be able to go back into the land of the dead and learn his history and learn everything about it, it's just so groundbreaking because, I mean, we have an altar set up, we keep it up year round of those that have passed. It's just like after Coco, it was just kind of like, oh wait, well, so-and-so, like, make sure everybody is on there because we want them to be able to cross over and spend it with us. Not that that's how it works, but that's how it works. So it just kind of like stuck in our head, like, oh dang, make sure everyone is there on the altar. And like you said, it ties in everything. It ties in that religious aspect of, you know, the dead aren't really dead. They're not gone forever. It ties in the food because on Dia de los Muertos, you can leave their favorite food or drink to, so that they have something when they come back. But Coco was just an amazing film. And the fact that they released it in English and Spanish, like, oh my gosh. I could go on forever about Coco because everybody got something from it, I think, at least in my family and my community. I had heard it was sad, and I went and saw it with my boyfriend at the time, and I was like, have you heard anything about the movie? And he was like, no. And I was like, you're gonna cry. And he was like, no, I'm not. But he had lost his mom when he was in high school, so I was like, you're going to cry. And he was like, no, I'm not. He was crying like a baby at the end. I was crying. And then I took, like, all my siblings, we all saw it separately, and then we all took our mom to see it, and we're like, but Mom, you're gonna cry. And she was like, it's a Disney movie, I don't think I'm gonna cry. She cried. So she then took her mom, she took my grandma to see it, and she was like, but be careful, because it's gonna bring up emotions. And my grandma was like, no, it'll be fine, it's a kid's movie. And it really captured how we mourn our loved ones and how we deal with death and loss, and they're not really gone. And the artwork, the alebrijes, and just that little snippet into our culture did so much I think it took us leaps and bounds, because now I feel like people want to know and people want to understand a little bit more.
Yes, so 3 quick points and then we'll wrap up. 1, the importance of representation cannot be overstated. 2, the small details Coco got right was absolutely, like, the chancla, his grandma throwing chanclas at him. I was like, oh my gosh, like, flashbacks. Sometimes in Mexican culture, if your mom / grandma / older relatives are angry at you, they'll throw slippers called chanclas. They're like sandals. They'll take them off and throw them at you because they can't, they're not going to chase you down. They're just going to throw chanclas at you. And their aim is impeccable. And kind of 3, Dia de los Muertos, for those who might not know, Day of the Dead, is a celebration that happens at the end of October. First day of November in the Mexican community to celebrate those that have died, those that have passed on. The sugar skulls are a big feature of that. The pretty paper cutouts. A lot of families will construct altars with pictures of their loved ones, candles, their favorite food, big, bright, colorful flowers. In Mexico, a lot of times Dia de los Muertos celebrations happen at the cemetery because everybody is celebrating. But, here in the States, at least this far north, where there are not very many Mexican-only cemeteries where it would be, like, understood that we're not being disrespectful or desecrating anything, these celebrations are limited to the home. And one, Dia de los Muertos is kind of like the embodiment of the joining between, like, our Catholic colonizers and our indigenous ancestors. Kind of brings those things together. Latin America is known for being very devout Catholics, but a lot of aspects of the Catholic faith in Latin America have adopted indigenous practices that refused to die out. And so Dia de los Muertos is kind of like the personification of that. All right, so I think we're just about done for today. Thank you so much for coming on with me. I had such a wonderful time. I'm going to close with a quote from Claudia Flores. We must be impatient for change. Let us remember that our voice is a precious gift and we must use it. Thank you.
Program is brought to you by the Kansas City Business Association.